The first government of the United States of America was called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union between the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, known as the Articles of Confederation for short, or just the Articles for short. So how did the Articles work? Long story short, it didn't. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in another year and a half. Okay, but how were they supposed to work? Knowing how the Confederation was meant to function gives us a look at what America thought was important at the time, and its failures directly influenced the US Constitution that we have today. The first thing you notice when you read the Articles of Confederation is just how short it is. It contains 13 articles, most of which are only a few sentences long, or shorter. Take Article 1 for example. This is the whole thing. I don't even need to paraphrase it much. The Confederacy will be called the United States of America. Articles 2 and 3 deal with the relationship between the federal and state governments. 2 guarantees that the states of the Confederation retain every right that the Articles do not explicitly deny to them. 3 says that the states under the Confederation enter into a firm league of friendship, basically a defensive pact against foreign threats. These are the most important articles in the whole document when it comes to getting into America's headspace during this time period. It formalizes the rights of the states to act in effect as 13 independent nations that would agree to cooperate through a weak federal government. When the Articles were being drafted, America was still fighting Britain's centralized government, and they weren't ready to give power to another one. Article 4 deals with the rights of citizens within other states. Citizens of every state would have freedom of movement within all the other states, except for criminals and poor people. They would also have the same rights as people born in that state. Major criminals that fled across state boundaries would also be required to be extradited back to where the crime took place. Article 4 ends with an understanding that states will honor the judicial proceedings in other states, but it doesn't say what Congress can do if states didn't cooperate. Article 5 framed what the federal government would look like. Each state would send between 2 and 7 delegates to Congress every year. Each state would get 1 vote as long as it had at least 2 delegates present, and if the delegates were tied within that state, they cast no vote. Congressmen were chosen by the state legislatures, and the people never voted on who got sent to Congress. Congress would name a president who would moderate debates and ensure that procedure was being followed within Congress. Some people like to say that this was some kind of secret president of the United States or something, but he was a presiding officer, not a head of state. None of his powers went further than Congress itself. Article 6 deals with the few powers that would be taken away from the states. Mostly this was stuff that would complicate the relationship between the states or overlap with the few powers that the federal government would receive. This includes stuff like entering into smaller alliances with other states or foreign powers, receiving ambassadors or diplomats from kings or other foreign countries, declaring war, hiring pirates, keeping a navy, that kind of stuff. They were barred from maintaining a standing army, but they were required to maintain a state militia. Article 7 guarantees that militias raised by states would have their officers under the rank of colonel chosen by the state legislatures. The rest would be chosen by the federal government. Higher-ups in the army during the Confederation period were generally in favor of a stronger national government, since wars tended to be easier with one big cooperating army rather than 13 small bickering ones. Congress's revenue-raising powers were granted through Article 8. Every state was required to pay a sort of membership fee to Congress, known as a requisition. The amount paid was determined by the perceived value of land in each state's borders. So Virginia, which back then had authority over West Virginia and Kentucky, would have to raise more requisitions than, say, Delaware. The Articles just expected that the states would pay these requisitions willingly, and it says nothing about what Congress could do if they refused. Article 9 is a big one. It enumerates the powers that the federal government would have. Remember, everything that the federal government could do had to be explicitly written down in this document, so they had to be sure that they got it down here. Congress could declare war, make peace, send and receive ambassadors, ratify treaties, as long as those treaties did not restrict the state's trading rights, enlist pirates, try crimes in the high seas, print and regulate its own currency, manage trade with the Indian tribes on behalf of the states, regulate post offices and roads, and raise armed forces in times of war. The Confederation also served as a court where states could resolve disputes between themselves. A majority of the states had overlapping Western claims with each other that had to be ironed out if the firm League of Friendship was going to remain friendly. If a state had a grievance with another, they could come to Congress and ask for mediation. Congress would name a commissioner who would then attempt to solve the issue with a compromise. If they could solve it outside of court, then the matter ended there. But if not, then Congress would begin to select judges to be considered to hear the case. Congress started with a list of 39 candidates, 3 from every state. Both parties then took turns striking names from the list until only 13 remained. This way, candidates that looked objectionable or biased towards one side or the other were removed before they could hear the case. Congress took this remaining 13 and took off another 4 to 6 candidates depending on the case, and then from that group, 5 were chosen at random. These 5 men would become the judges that would hear the case. The decision they made was final, and states would be bound to its decision whether or not they showed up to court. Again, nothing was said about what Congress could do if a state rejected their decision. The final part of Article 9 states that major actions of Congress would require 9 out of 13 of the states' approval, in other words, a supermajority. This included declaring war, ratifying treaties, and even passing a budget. Article 10 states that when Congress is in recess, 2/3 of the states can act on Congress's behalf and carry out powers reserved to Congress. This is a pretty mundane article, but it really reinforces this idea that states could act independently from Congress, and this article gives them explicit permission to go over their heads. Article 11 is an interesting one. If Canada wished to join the Confederation, they could, and Congress didn't even have the option to block their admission. Any other colony or territory that wished to join the Union would need at least 9 states to agree to let them in. The Republic of Vermont invoked Article 11 when it applied to join the Confederation. However, the southern states did not want another free state that would vote with New England. New York also had a small border dispute with Vermont where it claimed the entire state, so they blocked their entry as well. Vermont ended up outside the United States and just did its own thing for a while. Article 12 says that the government will honor all the debts and bills of credit that were incurred by the Continental Congress. Finally, Article 13. It says that the union between the states shall be in effect for all time, and once you were in, you couldn't leave. It also provides a method for adding amendments to the articles. Any change made to the articles would require a unanimous vote from each of the 13 states in Congress. A supermajority in politics is a rare thing, but a unanimous vote is as good as impossible. In the 8 years that the articles were in effect, not one amendment succeeded. Then the articles make one final plea that states pinky promise that they'd follow Congress's orders, and that's everything. So let's do some reading between the lines to see what's not in the articles. One of the most glaring omissions is in Article 8. In terms of revenue, the federal government was unable to raise any taxes other than the requisition system. On paper, these requisitions would be enough to fund the federal government, but this didn't end up being the case. When the threat from Britain was gone, the states had no reason to pay these requisitions. And to really drive home this point again, if the states refused to comply, the Confederation Congress had no power to force the states to pay the requisitions. In a similar vein, the articles painstakingly laid out a way that the federal government could resolve issues between the states, even going as far to say that the commissioner's word on the matter was final. But what if a state still refused? The federal government had no authority and no money to do anything about it. So if a state decided that it didn't like Congress's resolution, maybe they would just ignore what the commissioners would have to say. Also, just look at the structure of the government. Congress had legislative powers, influence over judicial proceedings between the states, and, in theory, executive power. There's only one branch of government. Having multiple branches of government gives a country some flexibility, but under the Articles, when Congress was deadlocked, the whole federal government ground to a halt. The end result of these failures was a government that was not taken seriously by its neighbors, and it wasn't even taken seriously by its own member states. And most crucially, it had no realistic path to fixing its inherent problems. Getting America back on track was going to take some rule breaking.